Hello everyone. Welcome to Realist Quill. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? April in Louisiana brings a particular kind of evening. The air thick with jasmine and honeysuckle. Humidity clinging to your skin like an old friend who doesn't know when to let go. On such an evening in 2016, my best friend Tony and I were headed to a birthday party in our hometown of Baton Rouge. It was our mutual friend's 23rd birthday celebration, and her parents had allowed her to throw a party at their house in Santa Maria, an upscale neighborhood known for its sprawling homes and manicured lawns. Tony and I were practically vibrating with excitement. We'd both grown up in modest parts of town, and the chance to party in one of Baton Rouge's premier neighborhoods felt like a glimpse into another world. The trouble was, neither of us knew the area well. I was driving while Tony occupied the passenger seat, attempting to navigate while simultaneously curating our pre-party playlist. He had an uncanny talent for selecting perfect get-hyped songs, but his navigation skills left much to be desired. "Dude, this track is going to set the mood perfectly," Tony said, cranking up the volume as he scrolled through Google Maps. "All right, I think we want to take the next right." Santa Maria is divided into 4 distinct sections, separated by a sprawling golf course. We eventually found the correct section, but locating the specific street proved challenging. According to a text from another friend, we were looking for a house on Menchac, but we quickly discovered this wasn't nearly specific enough. After turning onto Menchac Lake Drive, we were suddenly faced with a bewildering array of options: Menchac Way Avenue, Menchac Trace Avenue, and Menchac Crossing Avenue. 4 different streets, all named Menchac. "Call Jessie," I suggested to Tony. "Ask her which Menchac we want." Tony dialed, but when our friend answered, the background music was so deafening we could barely make out her voice. "What? Menchac what?" Tony shouted into the phone. "I can't hear you." She promised to check with the birthday girl and call us back, but that call never came. We found ourselves driving up and down various Menchac streets, looking for house numbers matching what we'd been given. "Maybe look for parked cars," I suggested, "or people hanging out front." "Hard to tell," Tony replied, peering through the darkness. "Wait. Both these houses have cars lined up outside." What made our search more difficult was that the party was being held in the backyard and pool area, part of the agreement with our friend's parents to minimize damage to the house interior. This meant no visible revelry from the street, no music thumping through open windows, none of the typical signs of a celebration in progress. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, frustration began to set in. "Let's just pick one and check," Tony said. "Worst case, someone tells us we're at the wrong place." I turned down a driveway of one of the Menchac homes, stopped the car and cut the engine. For a moment, Tony and I sat in silence. I remember that silence, complete and unnerving, and how it triggered a warning signal in my brain. The house was dark, curtains drawn. This wasn't where 20-somethings were celebrating a birthday. "I don't think this is it," I said softly. "Hold up," Tony whispered. "Is that someone at the window?" A flicker of movement near the curtains caught our attention. Someone was home, peering out at us from behind the drapes. If this was the party house, they certainly weren't welcoming guests with open arms. "Let's go," I said, reaching for the ignition. "This doesn't feel right." "Relax," Tony replied with a casual confidence that still haunts me. "What's the worst that could happen?" Those were the last words he spoke before my windshield exploded. Glass rained down on us as gunshots shattered the night. Flashes erupted from an upstairs window, each muzzle flare briefly illuminating a dark silhouette. My mind struggled to process what was happening. Were we being shot at? In Santa Maria, this couldn't be real. Time seemed to slow down. As I felt each impact of bullets striking the car, I was frozen, paralyzed by a terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Then, as if something else took control of my body, I heard a voice in my head screaming, "Put the car in reverse or you're both dead." Raw panic crystallized into desperate action. My trembling hands fumbled with the gear shift, finally finding the tires squealed against the pavement as I slammed the accelerator, the car lurching backward with such force that my head snapped forward. "Go, go, go," Tony yelled, though his voice sounded strangely weak. I checked the rear-view mirror, terrified someone might be behind us, then shifted into drive and floored it. The car shot forward, engine roaring as we sped away from the hail of bullets. Wind rushed through the shattered windshield, carrying with it the acrid smell of gunpowder and something metallic, blood. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we escaped down the winding streets of Santa Maria, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I was about to shout something triumphant about our narrow escape when I glanced at Tony. The streetlights illuminated his face in flashes as we sped along, revealing a pallor that made my stomach drop. His eyes were wide with shock, his breathing labored, and dark stains were spreading across his shirt. "Tony," my voice cracked. "Tony, talk to me, man." He tried to respond, but only managed a wet cough that spattered the dashboard with crimson droplets. "Hospital," he wheezed. "Need hospital." Terror gave way to a new kind of determination as I pushed the car's engine to its absolute limits. The world outside became a blur of lights and shadows as I weaved through traffic, cutting off other drivers and running yellow lights. I kept stealing glances at Tony, watching helplessly as he grew paler and weaker beside me. "Hold on," I pleaded. "Just hold on. Baton Rouge General is right off the interstate. 5 minutes, Tony. Just give me 5 minutes." I had no idea how many times he'd been hit. In the chaos, I realized I might have been shot too. There was something warm and wet soaking my legs and stomach, but I couldn't look, couldn't check. If I lost focus for even a second at these speeds, we'd both be dead. The thought that I might be bleeding out while driving was terrifying. What if I passed out at the wheel? What if I couldn't get Tony to help in time? These questions pounded in my brain with each heartbeat as I swerved onto the exit ramp, nearly colliding with another car. I skidded into the hospital parking lot, tires screeching as I pulled up directly outside the emergency entrance. I threw the car into park, leaped out and raced around to Tony's side while screaming for help. When I yanked open his door, the interior light revealed the full extent of the damage. Tony's face was ashen, his lips tinged blue. He was struggling for each breath, blood soaking his shirt and pooling in the seat beneath him. His eyes had that distant, glazed look that I'd only seen in movies, the look of someone slipping away. "Stay with me," I begged, gripping his shoulder, shaking him gently. "Help is right here. Tony, don't you dare check out on me now." Paramedics rushed over with a gurney. As they lifted Tony from the car, one of them asked if I was hurt. I looked down at my soaked pants and realized with a mixture of relief and shame that what I'd felt wasn't blood but urine. In the midst of the shooting, I'd completely lost control of my bladder. I sat in the waiting room for what felt like eternity, still damp, covered in tiny glass shards and specks of Tony's blood. Time stretched and warped around me. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to burn my retinas, the antiseptic smell turning my stomach. I checked my phone compulsively, both to update our friends and to mark the passing of minutes that felt like hours. Every time a nurse entered the waiting area, I'd look up hoping for news, only to watch them call someone else's name or walk through without stopping. The uncertainty was its own special kind of torture. Finally, a doctor in blue scrubs approached me. I steeled myself for the worst. But when he told me Tony was alive and they were optimistic about his recovery, I nearly collapsed from relief. I had to place my head in my hands to hide the tears that sprang to my eyes. The doctor explained that although a bullet had entered Tony's chest, it had miraculously missed his heart and major arteries. However, it had collapsed a lung, which explained his labored breathing. They had inserted a chest tube to reinflate the lung, and while a broken rib would cause him pain for weeks to come, his prognosis was good. I went home to shower and change, then returned with several friends who had been at the party we never reached. When we were finally allowed to see Tony, walking down that hospital corridor felt like the longest journey of my life. Entering his room in the intensive care unit was surreal. Tony lay amid a tangle of tubes and wires, his skin still unnaturally pale against the white hospital sheet. But when he saw us, his face brightened with a weak smile that meant everything. Despite his condition, Tony seemed genuinely happy to see us. He couldn't move much, but he had just enough energy after waking from surgery to speak briefly before the nurses shooed us out, insisting he needed rest. Before we left, Tony and I shared a moment alone. He looked me in the eye and said, "You saved my life, man." I shook my head firmly. "You've got it backwards. You saved mine." And I meant it. If I had driven to that party alone, I have no doubt the shooter would have aimed for me instead. But Tony had been holding his phone, the screen on full brightness, which from the shooter's perspective lit him up like a target. The gunman wasn't a great shot. He only landed one bullet directly, but Tony's illuminated silhouette had inadvertently drawn fire away from me. If I had taken that bullet instead, I would have passed out at the wheel, and we both would have died on those winding Baton Rouge streets, never making it to the hospital. Tony remained hospitalized for just over a week. Coincidentally, he was released the same day that the man who shot him pleaded no contest to charges of attempted manslaughter, downgraded from attempted murder during plea negotiation. We later learned that the shooter's home had been targeted in 2 separate home invasions within the previous year. One group of invaders had been caught and imprisoned, but apparently, one of them had threatened our shooter, warning that his homies would be coming for revenge. So when our unfamiliar car pulled into his driveway late at night, he opened fire without warning or question. His attorney argued that he was suffering from severe PTSD and paranoia, but even though this was his first conviction, the judge deemed him a danger to the community and sentenced him to 3 years in prison. I would have preferred a longer sentence, but after initially fearing he might receive no jail time at all, even 3 years felt like some measure of justice. Tony has since made a complete physical recovery, though the psychological scars remain for both of us. In the months following the shooting, I struggled with nightmares and would break into a cold sweat whenever I heard a car backfire or fireworks. I also dealt with the shame of having wet myself during the attack, until I joined a therapy group and met a former Marine who helped me put things in perspective. I knew guys in Afghanistan who'd piss themselves every time bullets started flying, he told me with a casual shrug. Some would actually roll onto their sides mid-firefight, just to avoid soaking their gear. None of us thought they were cowards. When I expressed surprise at his reaction, he laughed. "I'm laughing at the idea that you consider yourself a coward," he explained. "I've heard your story. You did everything exactly right. Backing out of that driveway under fire, getting your friend to a hospital without crashing. That's impressive stuff. You'd have made a fine Marine." I thanked him for his words, but when I returned to my car afterward, I broke down completely. His validation meant more than I could express. It was the first time since the shooting that I hadn't felt like a complete failure for being so terrified. What amazes me most about this whole ordeal is Tony's capacity for forgiveness. He has somehow found it in his heart to forgive the man who nearly took his life. He was scared, Tony told me once. He made a terrible mistake, but he wasn't a monster. He was just a guy who thought he was protecting his family. I wish I could reach that level of grace, but I'm not there yet. Maybe someday. For now,
I'm just grateful that a wrong turn in Baton Rouge ended with both of us still alive to tell the story.
For our second anniversary, my boyfriend Rob and I planned what should have been a perfect getaway. A weekend at a luxury log cabin nestled in the hills of Tennessee. Our love story had begun in the most cliché way possible. I accidentally knocked over his iced latte at our local coffee shop, soaking his pristine white shirt with caramel-colored coffee. "I'm so sorry," I gasped, frantically grabbing napkins. Rob had just laughed it off, his green eyes crinkling at the corners. "Don't worry about it. Wasn't my favorite shirt anyway." When I bumped into him again the following week, I offered to pay his dry cleaning bill. He countered with a better idea. "How about you take me to dinner instead?" The chemistry between us was undeniable, and 2.5 years later, we were driving through Tennessee, headed for a romantic weekend after spending a few days with Rob's parents in Nashville. When Rob first suggested a cabin getaway, I was skeptical. Rob and his family were outdoor enthusiasts in the most intimidating sense. They hiked, fished, hunted, and seemed to thrive in environments that terrified me. My idea of roughing it was a hotel without room service. "It won't be some dilapidated hunting shack," he promised over dinner one night. "Just wait until you see it." When I remained unconvinced, he pulled up the website on his phone. The cabin he'd selected was nothing short of spectacular. Perched on a hillside overlooking the mountains, it featured a sprawling deck with a fire pit and hot tub for stargazing. Inside, vaulted ceilings with exposed wooden beams soared above an open floor plan that included a gourmet kitchen, leather sofas, and a massive stone fireplace. "And look," Rob pointed out, scrolling to another photo. "The bathroom has heated floors and a rainfall shower big enough for two." My skepticism dissolved into excitement. I'd never stayed anywhere so luxurious, and the thought of spending our anniversary weekend curled up with Rob in front of that fireplace, maybe sipping wine in the hot tub under the stars after a day of exploring the woods, was intoxicating. We spent 4 lovely days with Rob's parents in Nashville, who turned out to be the warmest, most welcoming people imaginable. His mother insisted on teaching me her secret recipe for buttermilk biscuits, while his father took me aside to show me embarrassing childhood photos of Rob, much to Rob's mortification. On Friday morning, we loaded our bags into the rental car and hit the road, headed for a small community called Coker Creek near the North Carolina border. Everything was going perfectly. We stopped in Chattanooga for lunch at a charming riverside cafe, ahead of schedule and filled with anticipation. But once we passed Coker Creek and turned onto the winding back roads leading to our cabin, our progress slowed dramatically. This was the late 2000s, so while our rental car did have an early GPS system, it proved utterly useless in the densely forested hills. The satellite signal came and went, leaving us with printed directions and a paper map as our primary guides. We realized the directions were inadequate when we hit our first dead end with no luxury cabin in sight. Only dense forest surrounded us, the trees pressing close to the narrow gravel road as if trying to reclaim it. We backtracked, consulted the map, and tried again, and again, and again. Each attempt led us deeper into the woods before we'd become so disoriented that we'd have to find our way back to the main highway. With each failed attempt, our frustration mounted. The beautiful day was waning, and the thought of navigating these unmarked roads after dark filled me with dread. "One more try," Rob said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I think I know where we went wrong last time." We turned down yet another unmarked road, but this time instead of ending in another wall of trees, we spotted a house at the end of a long driveway. "Let's ask for directions," Rob suggested, relief evident in his voice. "Whoever lives here must know the area." The house before us looked ancient and neglected. What might have once been white paint had peeled away to reveal patches of rotting wood. The roof sagged in places with missing shingles and sections covered in thick moss. As we approached the porch, I noticed substantial gaps in the floorboards and splintering banisters that seemed one strong wind away from collapse. When Rob placed his foot on the first step, the wood emitted a creak so loud it sounded like a warning. The moment the porch steps announced our presence, we heard movement from inside. All the windows were covered, some with dirty cloth, others with what appeared to be newspaper, creating an impenetrable barrier between us and whoever was inside. Rob knocked on the door. "Hello? Sorry to bother you, but we're a bit lost." No response, though the shuffling inside continued. "We're trying to find a rental cabin in the area." Rob tried again, raising his voice slightly. "We're just looking for directions." The shuffling inside ceased abruptly. For several seconds, silence hung in the air like a physical presence. Then came the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being racked. "You've got 5 seconds to get back in your car and leave my property," a gravelly voice called from behind the door. My blood ran cold. Rob's hand found mine, squeezing it tightly as he backed away slowly. "We're leaving," he called back, his voice remarkably steady. "Sorry to have bothered you." We retreated to the car with measured steps, fighting the urge to run. As Rob turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the house and caught a fleeting movement at one of the windows. A corner of newspaper pulled aside, just enough for someone to peer out. "Jesus Christ," Rob muttered as we pulled away. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I replied, my heart still hammering in my chest. "But let's not go back to find out." The sun was beginning to set now, casting long shadows across the road. We needed to find our cabin soon, or resign ourselves to driving back to the nearest town and finding a motel for the night. Just as we were about to give up, Rob spotted a small weathered sign partially obscured by overgrown foliage. "Look, luxury cabins," with an arrow. How did we miss this before? He turned onto a steep gravel drive that wound up the hillside. After a few minutes of climbing, the trees parted to reveal several beautiful log cabins scattered across the mountainside. Relief washed over me as we pulled up to one that matched the photos we'd seen online. "See? I told you it would be perfect," Rob said, planting a kiss on my cheek. And it was. The cabin was everything the website had promised, even better in person. After the tension of being lost in the bizarre encounter at the old house, stepping into the warm, luxurious space felt like entering a sanctuary. As Rob brought in our luggage, I explored the cabin. The kitchen gleamed with high-end appliances. The living room featured a plush sectional sofa facing the stone fireplace, and the bedroom boasted a king-sized bed with a view of the mountains. "Let's forget about earlier," I suggested, wrapping my arms around Rob's waist. "We're here now. Let's make the most of our weekend." That night, we grilled steaks on the deck and soaked in the hot tub beneath a canopy of stars. With each passing hour, the memory of the decrepit house and its hostile occupant faded from my mind. The next morning, we hiked a nearby trail that led to a spectacular waterfall. Though I'm not usually one for outdoor activities, even I had to admit that the fresh mountain air and stunning vistas made for a magical experience. Rob seemed thrilled to share this part of his world with me. pointing out various plants and birds along the way. When we returned to the cabin that afternoon, we found a note taped to our door. Join us at Cabin 3 tonight for drinks and s'mores around the fire pit. 8 p.m. Mark and Lisa must be the couple from the cabin down the hill, Rob said. I saw them this morning when I went for coffee. They seemed nice. I hesitated. I thought this was supposed to be a romantic weekend just for us. It will be, he assured me. We'll just pop over for a drink, be sociable for an hour, then come back here for our own private celebration. He winked suggestively. I relented, and that evening, we made our way to Cabin 3, where we found Mark and Lisa already sitting by a roaring fire with another couple, Brian and Tara. They welcomed us warmly, offering glasses of wine and introducing themselves as fellow anniversary celebrants. As the night progressed, our conversation flowed easily. Mark and Lisa were celebrating 10 years together, while Brian and Tara were newlyweds of just 6 months. We shared stories of how we met our partners, laughed over relationship mishaps, and discussed our respective careers. When I mentioned our ordeal getting lost the previous day, including our encounter with the shotgun-wielding recluse, the mood shifted noticeably. You didn't go to the old Pritchard place, did you? Mark asked, his expression darkening. I don't know whose place it was, Rob replied. Just an old rundown house a few miles from here. Lisa and Mark exchanged glances. Brian leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. That would be Old Man Pritchard, local legend around these parts. Used to own most of this mountain before selling it off to developers in the 90s. Kept one small parcel for himself, that decrepit house you found. What's his story? I asked, suddenly intrigued. Lisa took a sip of her wine. According to locals, he was once married to a beautiful woman who ran off with his best friend. Drove him mad with grief and rage. He became a recluse, suspicious of everyone. Some say he booby-traps the land around his property, Brian added. But that's probably just to scare off the teenagers who try to sneak up there on dares. Well, he definitely scared us, I said, shuddering at the memory. Count yourselves lucky, Mark said gravely. Not everyone who trespasses on Pritchard's land comes back to tell the tale. A heavy silence followed his words, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Then Lisa laughed, breaking the tension. Mark, stop it. You're going to give them nightmares. The conversation moved on to lighter topics, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Later that night, as Rob and I walked back to our cabin under a star-studded sky, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. You don't really believe those stories, do you? Rob asked, noticing my nervousness. Of course not, I lied. Just the wine making me jumpy. The rest of the weekend passed without incident. We hiked, relaxed, and enjoyed the luxury of our beautiful cabin. On Sunday morning, as we packed up to leave, I felt a pang of regret that our perfect getaway was ending so soon. We should come back next year, Rob suggested as we loaded the car. Maybe make it a tradition. I nodded enthusiastically. Despite the rocky start, our anniversary weekend had been everything I'd hoped for and more. As we drove down the mountain, Rob decided to take a different route back to the highway, one that wouldn't take us past the Pritchard house. I was grateful for his consideration, though I wouldn't have admitted my lingering unease about that place. We were just a few miles from the main road when something in the woods caught my eye, a flash of metal reflecting sunlight. Rob, did you see that? I asked, pointing toward the trees. He slowed the car, peering in the direction I indicated. See what? I'm not sure. Something metal, I think. Curiosity getting the better of him. Rob pulled over and cut the engine. "Let's check it out," he suggested, already opening his door. "Are you crazy?" I protested. "Haven't you seen any horror movies? This is exactly how people get killed." He laughed. "We're not in a horror movie, babe. It's probably just some old farm equipment. Come on, it's not far from the road." Reluctantly, I followed him into the woods. The underbrush was thick, making our progress slow, but after about 50 yards, we came upon a small clearing. In the center stood what appeared to be an old hunting cabin, far more modest than our luxury rental, but substantially better maintained than the Pritchard house. As we approached, the sunlight caught something metallic hanging from the cabin's porch roof, wind chimes made from what looked like small tools and silverware. "See, nothing scary," Rob said with a grin. "Just someone's little hideaway with some creative decorations." I was about to agree when the cabin door swung open. An elderly man stepped onto the porch, regarding us with curious but not unfriendly eyes. He was tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed white beard and weathered skin that spoke of decades spent outdoors. "You folks lost?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Rob, always the more socially adept of us, stepped forward. "Not exactly. We saw something shining from the road and got curious. Sorry if we're trespassing." The old man waved his hand dismissively. "No harm done. Those wind chimes tend to catch people's attention. Made them myself." "They're beautiful," I offered, relaxing slightly at his kindly demeanor. He beamed at the compliment. "Thank you, miss. Been making them for years now. Helps keep me busy." He paused, studying us. "You're staying up at one of those fancy cabins, aren't you?" We nodded. "Thought so. Don't get many locals wandering through these woods." He gestured toward 2 rocking chairs on his porch. "Care for some coffee? Just brewed a fresh pot." I was about to decline politely when Rob surprised me by accepting. "We'd love some, thank you." The old man introduced himself as Thomas and ushered us onto his porch. The inside of the cabin was visible through the open door, a simple one-room dwelling kept meticulously clean. Bookshelves lined one wall, while various tools and crafting supplies occupied another. As we sipped the surprisingly excellent coffee, Thomas shared stories of the mountains and how they had changed over the decades. He'd lived here his entire life, he told us, watching as developers transformed vast stretches of wilderness into vacation retreats for city folk. "Don't misunderstand," he added quickly. "I've got nothing against folks like yourselves enjoying these mountains. Better than seeing them stripped for timber or coal." When the conversation lulled, I found myself asking about Old Man Pritchard. Thomas's expression shifted, becoming something I couldn't quite read. "Harold Pritchard," he said after a moment. "Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken in quite some time. We had a run-in with him yesterday," Rob explained. "Nearly shot us for asking directions." Thomas nodded solemnly. "Sounds like Harold. Man's been through more than his share of hardship." "We heard his wife ran off with his best friend," I said, recalling Lisa's story. Thomas made a sound somewhere between a snort and a laugh. "Is that what they're saying up at those luxury cabins? Lord, how stories change." He set his coffee mug down, leaning forward in his chair. "Harold's wife didn't run off. She was murdered, along with their 2 children, while Harold was away on a hunting trip. The killer was never caught." I felt a chill despite the warm spring air. "That's awful," I whispered. "It broke him," Thomas continued. "He was never the same after that. Started seeing threats everywhere. Convinced the killer would come back for him too. Can't really blame him for being cautious with strangers." We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing this information. Thomas's version painted a very different picture of the man we'd encountered. Not a bitter misanthrope, but a broken soul consumed by grief and fear. The really tragic part, Thomas added, is that he sold most of his land to pay private investigators over the years. Spent everything he had trying to find justice for his family. Never found it. As we prepared to leave, Thomas disappeared into his cabin briefly, returning with 2 of his handcrafted wind chimes. A memento of your time in these mountains, he said, pressing them into our hands. We couldn't possibly, I began, but he cut me off. Please, I make dozens of these. Gives me joy to know they'll hang somewhere new. We thanked him profusely and made our way back to the car. As we continued our journey home, the wind chimes hanging from the rearview mirror caught the sunlight, filling the car with dancing reflections. I'm glad we stopped, Rob said after a while. Makes you realize there's always more to people's stories than what you first hear. I nodded, thinking about Harold Pritchard and the tragedy that had shaped his life. I thought about how easily narratives can shift and change. How the crazy old man in one story might be the broken-hearted victim in another. That night, as we unpacked in our apartment, I carefully hung Thomas's wind chime on our balcony. Each time the breeze stirred it to life, I found myself thinking about those Tennessee mountains and the stories they held. Some shared openly, others kept hidden behind locked doors and covered windows. Rob was right about one thing: we should make that cabin a tradition. There were more stories waiting for us in those mountains, more lives intersecting with our own, in ways we could never predict. And despite the moments of fear and uncertainty, or perhaps because of them, I found myself already looking forward to our return.
The disposable camera I unwrapped on my 10th birthday changed my life. While other kids tore through wrapping paper hoping for video games or football boots, I clutched that small plastic rectangle like it was made of gold. There was something magical about capturing a moment and then waiting. The anticipation building as I wondered how the photos would turn out. The process of getting those pictures developed seemed nothing short of wizardry to me. A small miracle unfolding in dark rooms I could only imagine. My parents watched with growing frustration as my passion for photography consumed me through secondary school. I understand their concern now. Report cards piled up with disappointing marks while I spent hours in the school darkroom or wandering the neighborhood with my camera. Teachers' concerned voices became background noise. I knew where my heart belonged. You need qualifications, my father would say, his voice tight with worry. You can't make a living just taking pictures. But I knew differently. The moment I turned 16, I left school, much to my parents' infinite dismay. Within weeks, I'd secured an internship with a professional photographer in London. A gruff, talented man who taught me more in 12 months than any university course could have. After that year, I struck out on my own, freelancing for anyone who'd pay. Those early years were lean. I'd photograph anything. Weddings I had no interest in. Corporate events that bored me to tears, even pets when the owners paid enough. But slowly, frame by frame, I built a portfolio that spoke of something more than just technical skill. There was heart in those images, a way of seeing the world that eventually caught the right eye. The job market for photography can be cutthroat, and without sugarcoating it, many opportunities were either excessively seedy or mind-numbingly dull. I turned down more offers than I care to remember. Fashion photographers who wanted assistants who'd look the other way during private shoots or corporate gigs, documenting office renovations. Then one day, scrolling through job boards, I saw it.
overseas photographer for the Times, one of the most prestigious newspapers in British history, needed someone to document the world's stories. My heart skipped several beats as I read the requirements, mentally checking them against my experience. I applied that night, spending hours perfecting my cover letter and selecting my best work. The interview was brutal. 3 senior editors and the photography director grilled me for nearly 2 hours on everything from my technical skills to my ethical boundary. I left the building convinced I'd failed spectacularly, my dreams evaporating like fog in morning sun. 3 days later, my phone rang. "We'd like to offer you the position," the voice said. "How soon can you start?" The job took me places I'd only seen in other photographers' portfolios. I captured the glittering skyline of Hong Kong at dawn, documented village life in remote parts of Peru, and photographed world leaders at summits that shaped international policy. Between assignments, I'd return to London with memory cards full of images and stories that few would ever hear, but that changed me irrevocably. But it was the conflict zones that truly tested me. Afghanistan in 2011 was my first. The mountains there held a stark, brutal beauty that contrasted with the destruction in the villages. Iraq followed in 2012, where the heat seemed to distort more than just the horizon. It bent reality itself, making streets I'd walked down in the morning unrecognizable by afternoon. Then in January 2014, my editor called me into his office. "We need someone in Syria," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The situation's evolving, and we need eyes on the ground. You interest?" For those who need a primer, the Syrian civil war had erupted in mid-2012 following protests that were met with violent government crackdowns. By 2013, various rebel groups were receiving foreign backing and taking the fight directly to government forces. But 2014 marked a distinct shift in the landscape of resistance. Before the end of 2013, it was mostly secular, pro-democracy rebels fighting under the banner of the Free Syrian Army. By early 2014, however, Islamist and jihadi groups had begun to emerge, some reportedly connected to al-Qaeda. Our team's assignment was clear but dangerous. Drive into Aleppo, connect with our Free Syrian Army contact and determine what relationship, if any, the FSA had with these jihadi elements. The implications were enormous. For Syria, for international policy, and potentially for the flow of weapons into the region. We flew to Turkey in late February, spent several days in a city near the Syrian border acclimatizing, gathering supplies and making final preparation. Then in early March, we crossed over. Syria felt different from Iraq and Afghanistan. When I'd visited those countries, the conflicts had begun to wind down. Foreign forces maintained some semblance of order, and there were established protocols for journalists. Syria, however, was a live war zone, a conflict in its most volatile estate. We didn't fly in on military aircraft or cross at official checkpoints. We slipped across the border in the early morning darkness, without permissions or safety net. There was no evacuation plan if things went sideways, no military base where we could seek refuge. We were entirely on our own, and that realization sat like a cold stone in my stomach. After driving into eastern Aleppo, we connected with our rebel contact in a district called Jabal Badro. The journalist I was accompanying, Ben, had worked with Omar on a previous trip to Aleppo back in 20. Their reunion was surprisingly emotional. Two men who had shared experiences in a war zone, reconnecting in the midst of even worse chaos. Ben had won over Omar and his unit during his previous visit by bringing them cartons of cigarettes and boxes of basic medicines, painkillers, antibiotics. He repeated the gesture during our visit, and I watched as hardened fighters broke into childlike smiles over packets of paracetamol and rolls of gauze. In a place where the simplest comforts had become luxuries, These small offerings meant everything. The week we spent with Omar's unit was as positive as it was productive. I picked up basic Arabic phrases, shared meals with the rebels, and captured what I consider some of the best photographs of my career. Images that conveyed both the humanity and the horror of civil war. There was one shot in particular. A young rebel, barely 20, cradling a kitten in one hand while his other rested on his rifle. The contrast spoke volumes about the lives interrupted by conflict. But that first week was merely an acclimatization period. Both physically, crust was it hot, and mentally, we had plans to spend our second week with another group of rebels, who, unlike Omar's secular unit, were more connected with the jihadi group known as the Nusra Front. The NF, as I'll call them for simplicity's sake, had ties to Al-Qaeda. Their leader had been sent into Syria in 2011 to exploit the civil war's chaos and establish a foothold. Once there, with a taste of power he wasn't keen on relinquishing. Despite their extremist ideology, the NF's leadership wasn't stupid. They knew that harming Western journalists would damage their image, and potentially cut off the flow of weapons that the US and EU were providing to larger, more moderate rebel groups. So while we weren't exactly looking forward to being near NF-controlled areas, we weren't actively afraid of being targeted either. But fate, as it often does in war zones, had other plans. Finding your way around a city you don't know is challenging under normal circumstances. Now imagine that city after years of airstrikes and artillery bombardments. Street signs, landmarks, familiar buildings, all reduced to rubble. The thin layer of dust that covered everything made all the streets of eastern Aleppo look eerily similar. I'm a photographer, not a writer, so let me cut to the chase. We got lost. Hopelessly, thoroughly lost. On our way to meet with the second, less extreme group of rebels, we took a wrong turn. We didn't realize our mistake until the men we thought had been sent to meet us suddenly aimed their rifles at us and ordered us to kneel in the street. Initially, we thought it was just our intended contacts being overly cautious about security. Everyone in a war zone is terrified of spies and informants. But we quickly learned that we hadn't stumbled upon our soon-to-be friends. We'd been captured by an entirely different group, one with strong ties to both the Nusra Front and another jihadi organization that hadn't yet made headlines in the West. Our driver, Athman, immediately began negotiating for our release. We assumed they wanted money, and Ben authorized a substantial payment. But according to the group's leader, a man called Abu Khalid, they could get far more by selling us to another, wealthier militant group operating out of a place called Raqqa. When we asked what would happen to us there, Abu Khalid shrugged and said he neither knew nor cared. All that mattered to him were the vast stacks of cash the Raqqa group was offering for British or American prisoners. It was a grim moment, accepting that we were now hostages in a war zone. We clung to the belief that both our government and our employers would work towards securing our release. And at that stage of the war, it made little sense for any armed group to simply execute us. There was too much money to be made by ransoming Western journalists. The group that had captured us stood to make $40,000 USD for Ben and me combined, an investment that could potentially yield millions for the Raqqa-based militants who planned to purchase us. It must sound absurd, but being a prisoner wasn't as terrifying as you might imagine. Our captors hated government loyalists far more than they could ever hate us. After a few days, when they realized we weren't going to attempt an escape, where would we go? They removed our restraints and allowed us to move from the basement to the main compound. Communication was challenged. We spoke fractured Arabic, and they knew minimal English, so Athman became our translator. As the days passed, our guards became increasingly curious about our lives in London. They asked countless questions. What was London like? What food did we eat? Where did we live? How did we spend our leisure time? Abu, clearly the senior guard, seemed particularly interested in our hobbies and passions. When the topic of football came up, Ben admitted he wasn't much of a fan.
He'd attended a private school and preferred rugby. But for me, photography came first, and football second. I'd been a devoted supporter of Queen's Park Rangers since childhood. I didn't expect Abu to know QPR. They're not a big Premier League team like Manchester United or Chelsea. But when I mentioned my allegiance, Abu's face lit up with a smile that transformed him from captor to fellow fan in an instant. He launched into an animated speech to Athman, who translated. Abu says he's a great admirer of your Moroccan attacking midfielder Adel Tarabt. My jaw dropped. Athman continued. Abu says Tarabt's contribution of 19 goals and 16 assists to QPR's 2011 season was a huge achievement for a player of his age, and he thoroughly deserved to win the championship's Player of the Season award. Abu was exactly right. As a die-hard QPR fan, I'd cheered for every one of those 19 goals. Tarabt was phenomenal during the 2010-2011 season, a bright star in our club's constellation. Through Athman, I asked Abu if he remembered the goal Tarabt scored on Boxing Day of 2010, what came to be known among fans as the Christmas cracker. Abu jumped from his seat, beaming with excitement. He mimicked Tarabt's moves, the cheeky back heel to evade one defender, tapping the ball through another player's legs, before unleashing a rocket of a shot that even the goalkeeper's best efforts couldn't stop. I was delighted watching this reenactment, or Tarabt as you might say. I asked if Abu remembered how Tarabt ran over after scoring and literally hugged random QPR fans in celebration. Those spontaneous moments of connection were why he was so beloved. He loved us, and we loved him, and neither side was afraid to show it. Abu nodded enthusiastically, remembering that exact moment, and just like that, we launched into a 2-hour conversation about football, with the other guards gathering around to listen. For those precious hours, the lines between captors and prisoners blurred. We weren't enemies or commodity. We were simply fans sharing our passion for the beautiful game. That conversation marked a turning point in our captivity. Although I couldn't know it then, I believe it was that chat about Tarabt that ultimately saved our lives. The next 2 days were almost pleasant. We received generous portions at mealtimes, shared cigarettes and sweets with the guards, and answered their endless questions about London. But on the evening of the second day, Abu asked to speak with me privately, which meant me, him, and Athman as translator. We moved to a quiet corner of the compound, and I cautiously asked if there was any news about the transfer. I made it clear that I wasn't making demands. I was simply anxious about being kept in the dark regarding our fate. Abu looked at Athman, then at me. After a heavy sigh, he began speaking, and as I watched Athman's face, I saw the color drain from it completely. Athman turned to me, his voice barely steady. Abu says he's hesitant to sell us to the group in Raqqa. Initially, I thought Abu was having second thoughts about the financial arrangement, perhaps feeling cheated at selling us for $40,000 when the other group stood to make millions from our ransom. But that wasn't what troubled him. Abu explained that he could live with selling us to someone who'd eventually release us after receiving a ransom payment. But that wasn't what the Raqqa group intended. This other group went by several names at the time: the Mujahideen Shura Council, the Army of the Victorious, the Congregation of Monotheism and Jihad. But the name they would soon become known by would live in infamy. ISIS. The group that wanted to buy us was just months away from officially renaming themselves the Islamic State, and their plans for us were horrific. They wanted us alive so they could decapitate us on camera, turning our executions into propaganda videos to be distributed online. By the time Athman finished translating, I felt physically ill. I begged Abu not to sell us to those people, promising that we could guarantee tens of thousands of pounds if they ransomed us instead. Abu shook his head. It was too late. ISIS representatives were already en route to collect us. They'd be at the swap location just outside Aleppo in less than 48 hours. And if we weren't delivered as promised, there would be severe consequences for Abu and his men. After several more minutes of desperate conversation, Athman turned to me with news I never expected. Abu had decided to escort us back to Omar's group, then tell his superiors and the ISIS representatives that we'd managed to escape during a government attack. He had two conditions. First, we had to leave Aleppo immediately. If his superiors discovered he'd let us go, he'd be executed. This was non-negotiable. His second request surprised me. He wanted the small QPR Supporters Club card I kept in my wallet. A memento to remember me by. I handed it over without hesitation. Just hours later, we were moving through the darkness toward Omar's compound. 48 hours after that, around the same time we should have been handed over to our ISIS executioners, we were waiting at Istanbul airport for our flight back to London. Then wrote the story he'd been assigned, using many of my photographs, but he made no mention of our kidnapping. And the pictures I took of our captors have never been published. I wanted Ben to acknowledge Abu's act of humanity, but we knew that would put his life at risk. In December 2016, following a prolonged and intense battle, the Syrian army retook control of Aleppo. Syrian state media announced that they had fully secured the city after an evacuation deal was reached for the remaining rebel fighters and civilians. There's a chance that Abu managed to escape. I know he wasn't fighting for what many would consider the right side of that conflict, though I'm not sure anyone could honestly call any group from that war the good guys, without choking on those words. I don't know what else Abu did during those terrible years, but I do know that he saved our lives when he had every reason not to. And for that I'll be eternally grateful. Sometimes I wonder if he's still alive, if he made it out of Syria, and if by some miracle you're reading this, Abu, and you're anywhere near Loftus Road, reach out. I'd love to take you to a match and talk about football in peace instead of war.